Studies, and I direct the Center for Feminist Research, and I'm a professor in English and Gender Studies and History, and I'm the Barbara Streisand Chair in Contemporary Gender Studies. This is just a great event. We're so thrilled about the turnout. Thank you all for showing. We're really excited about the conversation that's going to happen today. This has been an event that Tania and I have been in conversation about for about a year now, right? And I'm not going to spend any time really introducing this because I'm going to allow that honor to go to Professor Susan McCabe, who is seated here. But I do want to do introductions for all the speakers. Lynn Spiegel is the Frances E. Willard Professor of Screen Cultures at Northwestern University, and she is the author of TV by Design, Modern Art and the Rise of Network Television, published in 2009, University of Chicago Press. Also, Welcome to the Dream House, Popular Media and Post-War Suburbs, Duke, 2001, and Make Room for TV, Television and the Family Ideal in Post-War America, published in 92 by Chicago. She has also edited numerous anthologies, including the co-edited Feminist Television Criticism, A Reader, both editions of which have Tania's path-breaking article on soap opera in them. She is the editor of the Consoling Passions and spin-off book series at Duke University Press, and she is also a 2012-13 Guggenheim Fellow. Seated next to Lynn is Kara Keeling, Associate Professor of Critical Studies in the School of Cinematic Arts and of African American Studies in the Department of American Studies and Ethnicity at the University of Southern California. She is the author of The Witch's Flight, The Cinematic, The Black Femme, and the Image of Common Sense, Duke University Press, 2007. She is also co-edited with our colleague here, Josh Kuhn, a selection of writings about sound and American studies entitled Sound Clash, Listening to American Studies, Johns Hopkins University Press, 2012, and with Colin McCabe and Cornell West, a selection of writings by the late James A. Sneed entitled European Pedigrees, African Contagions, Racist Traces, and Other Writings, Palgrave Macmillan, 2003. Keeling's influential articles have also appeared in a number of journals, including GLQ, Kipa, The Black Scholar, Women in Performance. I would say that today represents something of a homecoming for Victoria Johnson, who earned her MA and PhD in our own Critical Studies program at the School of Cinema and TV. She is currently an Associate Professor of Film and Media Studies and affiliated faculty in African American Studies and Women's Studies at UC Irvine. Her Heartland TV, Prime Time Television and the Struggle for U.S. Identity, published by NYU Press in 2008, was awarded the Society for Cinema and Media Studies Catherine Singer Kovacs Book Award in 2009. She is currently working on a project that examines the cultural history of U.S. television through the lens of sports media and on the post-Title IX generation of women in sports culture and its commodification. Now, our honored guest, Tania Modleski, holds the Florence R. Scott Professorship in the English Department here at USC and is the author of two books which are at the center of today's discussion: 1982's Loving with a Vengeance, Mass-Produced Fantasies for Women, and 1988's The Women Who Knew Too Much. She is also the author of 1991's Feminism Without Men, and the 19... Oh, duh. Thank you. That was interesting, wasn't it? And the 1998 volume of her collected essays, Old Wives' Tales, and many, many articles. Tania is an exceptional thinker who has managed to trouble the critical currents in her own field of study, and her work has, obviously really reverberated in a number of disciplines: sociology, history, gender studies, American studies, and of course communications and media studies. Analyzing cultural text at the very bottom of our cultural escalator, Harlequin romances, TV soaps, and Gothic novels, Modleski has pulled off something quite unique: a trenchant analysis that rejects both false consciousness and syllogism at work in some cultural criticism, which, as Tania herself has put it, goes something like this. I really enjoy the Real Housewives of New Jersey. I'm a feminist, therefore the program must be feminist. Program here. She has been the president of the Modernist Studies Association and is the author of 4 books, including 2 critical studies Elizabeth Bishop, her Poetics of Loss, Penn State University Press in '94, and Cinematic Modernism, Modern Poetry and Film, Cambridge University Press 2005, and also 2 poetry volumes. Her current research marks a transition from writing in the genres of scholarly criticism and poetry to biography, a first full-length study, Breyer, Female Husband of Modernism. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Susan.
Thank you. Mine will be a little bit more of a personal reflection. I am so very honored to introduce my dear friend and colleague, Tania Modleski, the Florence R. Scott Professor of English at USC. I have known Tania now for over 10 years and have had time to try to fathom how her mind, or I'd like to say her unconscious, but no, her mind, or rather her genius works. I mean, and I truly am going to attempt, in very sketchy terms, is to attempt to lay out what I see as the kind of mechanisms or the kind of secret to her. Not that I could ever plumb what is the secret to her writing, but really that's what I'm sort of trying to think. What is how do we explain the great appeal of Tania? And that's really a hard task. And so half of my talk has turned into scribbled notes because half of it was not printed this morning, but that is probably just as well. So let me say a couple things here. I think that to get at her contribution is to see her as a really rare blend of the classic and the innovative. Her work scintillates, whether it's focusing on soap operas, chick lit, gothics, male weepies, or a recent article on Hitchcock's suspicious collaborations with women, as she's written this piece actually before the 2012 biopic on the filmmaker's troubled creative alliances with women. So she's very anticipatory, and she's got her finger on the pulse there. She's tapping into the paradoxes embodied by what one of her books in progress calls enduring feminism. And it's that kind of wit that characterizes her methodology as well, I think. She tackles the contradictions teased out through her formalist analysis, linked to methods of psychoanalysis, often foreclosed by so-called post-feminism. One of her paradoxes, just to be very reductive, is that Hitchcock is both highly misogynist and female identified, and she manages to bring that together. Another, that popular culture for women is both implicatingly regressive, transgressive, and pleasurable all at once, and enacting inchoate unconscious fantasies and drives. Many of Tania's articles on mass culture have been reprinted, and I think that's quite a nice poetic note. Her writing is eminently reprintable and translatable, which is also important. She's available now in languages, if you can read it, of Hungarian, Korean, French, Japanese, and probably more languages that I don't know. Case in point, the second editions of, and we're here in part, I think, to celebrate just in case someone missed it, the quarter century anniversary of The Women Who Knew Too Much, Hitchcock, and feminist psychoanalysis and feminist theory, and Loving with a Vengeance, written a couple of years earlier. Both studies resisted current practices in criticism and continue, I think this is the sort of the magic, is to continue to exert dynamic presence on pressure on questions like sexual identification or desire in spectatorship. That's just one small aspect. Both of these books had a tangible impact on emerging scholars, myself included, and with these new introductions, she quickly, miraculously distills a couple of decades of criticism, readjusts the frame with such a deft sweep. I mean, that I'm actually sort of seeing her as a writer and a thinker, you know, as much as I am a feminist, and so that all of these things are sort of coming together. She, you know, is the treatment of chick lit, for instance, in the new introduction to Loving with a Vengeance, takes up chick lit quickly but pungently, and brings and draws in all the major questions, and couples it with Japanese manga meets Harlequin, and inspires us as scholars, I think, to take popular culture as seriously as ever, and to dissect it with some of what we've learned from Tania's methodology. And here's the rest of it, is that, you know, just to sort of try to distill the ingredients of what is the appeal of her work as a thinker to me, is that she does, and this is sort of across the boundaries of high and low culture, she does, in some sense for me, her writing manages to have the kind of elegant wit of a John Donne poem, and also the cool irony of Austen, with the kind of sharp geometry that you find in, say, an episode of The Closer. So all of that, you know, and it gives us this provocative edge, you know, that will remains, and I think this is the gist of it, is it remains to induce us to have questions, as we know likely will have today. Thank you so much.
So anyway, first of all, thank you, Tania and Alice, for inviting me to be part of this really extraordinarily happy event. And I think, like, I've managed to kind of type things, but I've got a lot of scribble too, which I think might say something about the nervousness of trying to honor your friend, who is beyond, you know, words, really. I'm obviously really glad to have this chance to honor Tania's path-breaking contributions to feminist scholarship. Because Tania's not just a colleague, but also, as you can tell, a really old friend, I'm a little unsure of how to approach this. And I thought at one point about hiring Gilbert Godfrey to roast her with a battery of loud, trashy insults, because I think she'd like that. The way he does with Joan Rivers or Charlie Sheen. But I mean that lovingly and without vengeance. Since I'm a terrible, dirty joke teller, I'll resort to my more boring and respectable comfort zone, which is providing a little bit of historical context, but mostly talking about Tania. For those of you who may be less familiar with the history of feminist media studies, I'm briefly going to lay out some of the context in which Tania's work emerged and how it helped to shift discussions about women's relationship to mass culture. And I also want to provoke questions about how the discussions have changed or not changed, and why Tania's work remains a classic. Her first work is what I'll talk about mostly, Loving with a Vengeance, why this book remains, in my mind, and I think everybody's mind, a classic now. First, though, some personal history. I feel I should come clean because back in around 1982, 3 or 4, I wrote a really bad review of Tania's book, a really tough review, which was published in Camera Obscura. And I was an MA student at the time. Don't do that. It doesn't really get me off the hook, but you know.
Listen hard to that.
Okay, so we were reading Tania in the context of the wide-ranging debates on female pleasure in the cinema. And Tania's was really one of the few serious considerations of television at the time, and one of the best things to read on the subject. So, despite my tough review, it would wind up being a key reference and inspiration for my own work in my dissertation, especially the last chapter on soaps and women's lives in the home, and was quoted much more nicely there. But anyway, about 7 or 8 years later, after I wrote this review, I got a job at USC. And I was very, very nervous and very, very embarrassed about meeting Tania face to face. I figured she would hate me, or at least think I was a jerk. But it was really just the opposite. We became really close friends. And somehow this woman who had written the book on vengeance turned out to have an amazingly forgiving soul. So the other day before I came out here, I texted her and asked her if it was too weird if I would bring this up. And she texted back immediately saying, actually, I was thinking it would be really amusing for you to talk about the review. So given our checkered past, I'm happy now to get the chance to be part of this panel. In all of her work, Tania has a remarkable way of articulating a central set of problems with amazing interpretations, which all seem so clear as she presents them that you wonder why you never saw it before, at least the way she sees it. And that, I think, is one of the things that I love best about her work. It really articulates something and you say, oh yeah, why didn't I see it that way? It's so simple. It was staring me in the face, but I couldn't say it. And she has a way of getting you to have that oh yeah response in very clear ways, although she's dealing with unbelievably complicated issues. So Tania's work on women's mass-produced fiction emerged in the context, I think a lot of you know, the 1970s women's movement and the emerging field of feminist literary and film scholarship. As she makes clear in Loving with a Vengeance, but also in the Hitchcock book, her work was a response to the raging debates on female pleasure that had become central to feminist film studies, especially since Laura Mulvey's 1975 essay, Visual Pleasure in Narrative Cinema. That essay, as I'm sure, again, many of you know, used the examples of Hitchcock and von Sternberg to talk about the dynamics of the gaze in cinema and the objectification of women. Using psychoanalysis as what Mulvey called a weapon against patriarchy, she sought to reveal the processes of sadism and masochism at stake in the male gaze. As Tania details in her Hitchcock book especially, the Mulvey essay provoked a huge debate, still ongoing, about how to conceptualize women's pleasure in Hollywood cinema as anything but masochistic. Did women simply enjoy being objects of the gaze? Was there anything agentive for women to do? Was there any form of pleasure that wasn't masochistic? As one of the earliest responses to this, Tania's 1978 essay, The Search for Tomorrow in Today's Soaps, which was also the seeds for her chapter in Loving with a Vengeance on soaps, took the debates in a new direction. First, it focused on popular television, which people really weren't doing. And second, it searched for ways to understand the dynamics of women's pleasure, and to do so, she turned to different aspects of of Freudian scenarios, focusing on, for example, women's pre-Oedipal relations with mothers, separation anxieties, and female paranoia, especially entailed in the Gothic. And she also relied on Frederick, which I forgot, but I don't know why I forgot. She relied heavily on Frederick Jameson's reification and utopia in mass culture, which really was about the wish fulfillment of mass culture response to Adorno and Horkheimer, and the idea that mass culture had some kind of transformative effect and ability to express and contain anxieties and potentially create communities. So I had forgotten how important that was to you, and that I'm kind of interested in what you think of that now, if you have anything to say about your use of that. So for Tania, the point wasn't just to reverse Mulvey, but rather to highlight the ambivalence and contradictions involved in mass media and the positions of identification they afford. Revenge and anger were then a kind of double-edged sword that allowed for the fantasy expression of women's rage, but also belied guilt, fears of male retribution, and the general double consciousness entailed for female readers. So while Tania sees some possibility of utopian wishes or even female community being expressed in women's fiction, she doesn't forego the negative critique of patriarchy and the female isolation and alienation that popular culture often maintains and still encourages. And her ability, I think, to articulate female pleasure while still maintaining that negative critique is an exemplary juggling act. It's not easy to do. Tania isn't afraid to think about the dynamics of guilty pleasure, why we both love and hate The Bachelor, or Mad Men, or Honey Boo Boo, or Pick Your Sweet Poison. You know, I think this negative critique often gets lost in attempts to valorize the study of popular forms, which is always a challenge anyway. But I think it really got lost in a lot of the subsequent work in fan studies, and to be sure, that's a really hard thing to do because you're kind of doing ethnographic work with communities. You don't want to make negative judgments of those communities, but you wind up often losing your voice, so or your ability to have negative critique. So at any rate, maybe Tania could talk a little bit about that move, maybe propelled by Jan Redway's really important book, Reading the Romance, but I don't see Jan as doing that, who is my colleague now, and I'm not writing a negative review of Okay, so one other thing that has certainly changed since Tania wrote her book in the early 70s and 80s is that then women critics often thought about mass culture in relation to the creation of a woman's cinema. And Mulvey was an experimental filmmaker, you know, who helped create alternative modes of filmmaking against the grain of the Hollywood style. And in Loving with a Vengeance, you know, Tania talks about how we might use the example of soap operas to form a kind of aesthetic of pleasure for women's cinema. And that kind of dropped out, you know, and I guess for maybe some obvious reasons, but maybe for some obvious, not so obvious reasons. And I wonder, too, if maybe some of that might return with more channels of distribution, like YouTube, et cetera, for alternative filmmaking, if people are seeing other modes of filmmaking in this vein that merge critique and practice. And finally, another exemplary and really important to me part of Tania's critique of the soap opera form was her focus on the reception context and the general everyday life in which women watch TV, or at least the housewives that the industry targeted at the time. And that I think is one of her most really original contributions in that chapter, that, you know, we shouldn't just look at the text, we should look at this context of waiting, of women's lives, of the continual interruptions. And, you know, she even tries to kind of tweak Raymond Williams' concept of flow in that regard. And I wondered if you had been in dialogue at all with Birmingham School of Thought on soaps at that time, or this was just something that became part of the project without really, because that work hadn't been completely imported into the U.S. really until after you wrote Loving with a Vengeance. So it's kind of an interesting dynamic there. But anyway, I mean, that's the part of the work that I found especially important for my own kind of interests. In its own time and over the past 30 years, Loving with a Vengeance became a kind of Bible for the then fledgling field of feminist television studies, and it marked an important pedagogical turn in relation to the institutional logics of what could be studied in universities and what could not be studied. And at the time, feminist television criticism itself was growing up in the humanities with people like Radway or Ian Ng or Beverly Houston or Marcia Kinder or Michelle Matlart, also writing, and Charlotte Brunston, also writing about these things. And along with Tania's book, this work challenged really the male-defined canon of what constituted great art and the studyable. And, you know, that's something Tania, if you look back at the book, does straight off in Loving with a Vengeance, is to kind of talk about that hypocrisy of people at the Cahiers or Choose Your Auteur Theory saying we could study gangster films and westerns, male-defined genres, but, you know, these women weepies never, no, the only way you could study them was to study them, like, with putting hypodermic needles into women and saying, you know, they were neurotic and they were going to have sissies if they, you know, watched TV and made their boys watch TV. So, you know, that she really challenged that. But I kind of think it's interesting that today there's a whole bunch of television critics, both academic and newspaper critics, who are trying to kind of revalorize television as a second golden age. And in particular, have been turning to serials, like cable serials, like The Wire, which, may be great, but whatever. The Wire, Breaking Bad, which, again, or Mad Men. And curiously, by calling them great art, precisely because they're not melodrama and they're not soap operas. So a lot of this criticism is how they're serials, but not soaps. They're not those women's things, And of course, they all have these kind of center around these male protagonists who are victims of something, whether it be cancer or World War II vets who shot their buddy and left them in a hole and has an identity crisis. So it's kind of male melodrama with the victim we feel sorry for. And I wonder, Tanya, what you think about that kind of urge now to valorize those by saying, but they're not those things that are on the afternoon, and that appeal to women. Okay. Tanya came to Northwestern a few years back, and she just gave, I'm sure some of you have heard it here, this unbelievably great talk on Clint Eastwood. And the gist of it, very cleverly, was about his film, the title of his film, Unforgiven, but the gist of it was about the question of, so why do we forgive men and male heroes like Clint Eastwood pays, but we can't forgive women in that way? And it revolved around this issue of the victimized male of the male melodrama, so I wonder if in some ways these shows are part of that. Okay, so I want to end by thinking about why Loving with a Vengeance became a classic, a must-read book in so many courses now. I know that Tania has much to say about the particular moment of political and academic feminism in which her book emerged, and how feminism and feminist scholarship has changed over the years. Much of the work that emerged in the 70s and 80s focused on the women that Hollywood represented and addressed as their main heroines and consumers, in the case of soaps, white heterosexual women at home. Today, this vision of who counts as a woman is obviously no longer viable. And I know many of you, not least of course Tania, have thought and written about post-feminism, issues of cultural, national, racial, and sexual identities that trouble any notion of a single female voice or response to a text. So the concept of the woman as the white housewife mother today is also, of course, no longer viable in the post-network TV industry, which fragments audiences and narrowcast publics in new ways. What we see now are channels devoted to smaller constituencies, and this has made room for networks like Bravo or women's channels that play programs supposedly devoted to specific publics in their taste. And this is really a whole other issue that people like Vicki Johnson or Sarah Benet Weiser have written excellent things about, but it does speak to our somewhat different and new moment of consumer culture and how we're going to talk about these kind of narrowcast produced fantasies for publics. So today, harlequins and daytime soap operas are just as often considered camp or kitsch as they are, veritable text to read. So they're often considered now lovable, if laughable, relics from another world. This camp sensibility, thank you for getting that, this camp sensibility may in fact be the attitude most of our students adopt when they think about these new old media forms. And I think when I'm teaching Loving with a Vengeance, I'm always wondering how they're relating to it today, because they're really relating to it, But they obviously think these old shows are really silly and camp, but yet it seems really somehow more than that. I think the kind of kitschy camp sensibility may in fact be the attitude most of our students adopt when they think about these old forms. I do think there's something more than this, to the staying power of Loving with a Vengeance. I think the book is a classic because it continues to give students tools with which to unpack not just the specific media forms it interrogates, but also the more stubborn contemporary politics of local and global sexisms that still make women want to seek revenge, if only in mass-produced forms. So thank you, Tania, for giving voice to that pleasurable fantasy, but also the very real anger. And thanks for your continued energy, your amazing pedagogy, and for being a cherished friend.
So, thank you for joining me in celebrating Tania's work, and also thank you to the Center for Feminist Research and Alice Eccles for inviting me to participate today. It's actually, a pretty profound honor for me to have an opportunity to talk about Tania's work in this context, and also to be on a panel with Lynn and even you too.
Even me.
Yeah. And I think, part of what I said I was going to do was to talk mostly about the women who knew too much, because I was excited about the opportunity to revisit that text. But then when I started really looking at it again, I realized that it would be difficult for me to sort of capture in a shorter talk some of the things that I think are interesting about what you're doing in that, about what Tania's doing in that piece. So I've chosen to say some things about it, but also remark mostly on what it means to return to these texts today, because part of my experience in preparing for that, I think, was for this event, really brought that to my mind. So I think, I also am excited about this event because I think that we have far too few opportunities to remark upon and celebrate the significance of our colleagues' work, but perhaps even more than that, because we could actually celebrate each other's work privately, right? We have far too few opportunities to collectively assess the intellectual genealogies that have shaped our current intellectual context and authorized our own work. In my case, working primarily in film and media studies, Tania Modleski's work has been foundational to my own. And I don't mean that I cite her work regularly, because actually I don't think I do that much, but I should, to mark the debt that I owe to them. But I mean to say that the two books that we are celebrating today have shaped the fields that I claim as my own to such a degree that anyone working in those fields owes a debt to them, and that their influence on my fields has been so thoroughgoing as to render the actual primary texts themselves by now relatively invisible in the scholarship. And I'll say a little bit more about what I mean by that. So as I was thinking about what I might contribute to today's celebration and critical appraisal of Loving with a Vengeance and the Women Who Knew Too Much, I realized that these books had become like air. That is, they had become so ingrained in the academic discourse of feminist media studies that we by now take their interventions for granted. And I think this is especially the case of Loving with a Vengeance. And I think this is in part because the feminist film theory into which the women who knew too much so profoundly intervened itself has been relegated to varying degrees, right? It's still, as I think you point out, still a kind of ongoing conversation, but I think that moment has been relegated to our past in ways that the study of popular culture and mass culture in general have not. So Loving with a Vengeance, as you all know, was published in 1982, and by the time that I was in graduate school 11 years later, it was a book that everyone knew, even if everyone had not yet read it. Tania Modleski is a name that for me marked a set of ideas more than it did a person. And within the first 11 years of its publication, Modleski had become a shorthand that authorized work on popular culture and on mass culture that centered women as significant participants in those cultures. There is a way, I think, that Tania, like many widely influential thinkers, authorizes bodies of work to such an extent that it is difficult to recall that they themselves had to begin to carve out the spaces that we perhaps subsequently take for granted. And this is hard, brave work. In the context of academic feminism, the difficulty of doing that is compounded by the challenges that attend any move by a woman to claim legitimate authorship, such that her work could indeed also authorize and enable other related projects in the wake of her intervention. So when all of this really sunk in for me over the past several weeks, I felt incredibly intimidated. In addition to authorizing work on popular mass cultures, Loving with a Vengeance contextualizes modern romance novels within a longer history of the novel, reminding us of the novel's status as popular culture in its time. And I think that this is part of the kind of work of the classic and the innovative that I think is really compelling to me. It bridges literary studies and mass cultural studies, media studies, and marks a moment of innovation as cultural studies was being taken up and transformed in an American context. It also, and significantly, insisted on the work of interpretation as itself a politics. It posited that academic feminists might study what women read in order to gain a better understanding of the ideological work those texts accomplish, and moreover that we might do this to not uncritically valorize existing practices, but to participate in shaping the texts themselves as well as the reception of them through our work as critics. And with this in mind, then, the rest of my brief comments today take a cue from Tania's work, and dare I say that I believe that her work also authorizes these comments in order to call attention to the possibilities and opportunities that today's event offers for advancing present scholarly concerns in feminist media studies in particular, and for academic work in general. So an insistence that interpretation is an activity that participates in shaping the text with which a critic engages becomes more explicit in the 1988 publication of The Women Who Knew Too Much, Hitchcock and Feminist Theory. In that book, Tania wrote, and this is a long quote here, "In his recent work, The World, the Text, and the Critic, Edward Said has beautifully described the critic as one who is," this is a quote from Said, "responsible to a degree for articulating those voices dominated, displaced, or silenced by the textuality of text. Texts are a system of forces institutionalized by the reigning culture at some human cost to its various components. The critic's attitude should be frankly inventive, in the traditional sense of inventio, so fruitfully employed by Vico, which means finding and exposing things that otherwise may be hidden beneath piety, heedlessness, or routine." That's the end of the quote from Said, but continuing the quote from Tania, "Feminism, too, has by now its pieties and routines. Insofar as it all too readily accepts the ideals of male semiotic systems, feminism also needs to be challenged by a frankly inventive approach, an approach that, if it seems alien at first, is so only because it is situated in the realm of the uncanny, speaking with a voice that inhabits us all, but that for some reason has been made strange through fear and repression." And that's the end of all of the quotes. So this is one among the themes in Tania's early work that resonates with me as I reread her work today. So returning to this text on Hitchcock on an anniversary of its publication, I'm struck by the subtle boldness, if that makes sense, of the project's conceptualization. The book takes the centrality of feminist film theory's engagement with Hitchcock's films, starting with Laura Mulvey's reliance on those films to make the widely influential claims she makes in her landmark essay, Visual Pleasure in Narrative Cinema, and subjects those films to a frankly inventive approach that both undermines and furthers feminist film theory by reading Hitchcock's films from a different kind of psychoanalytic feminist perspective. So revisioning canonical text is hard work, and I think in that book that Tania gives us a real model for doing that really quite brilliantly. So picking up on themes in Loving with a Vengeance, then, The Woman Who Knew Too Much calls our attention back to the politics of interpretation, and the ways that interpretation is a strategy of and for power with profound implications for feminist praxis. While Tania's focus in that book is on Hitchcock's films and what reading them differently offers to feminist theory, I think it makes sense today to understand our role vis-a-vis earlier academic feminist formations along similar lines that we can, when we center issues of interpretation. So I think that one of the questions that we can bring to those earlier projects is interesting when posed in terms of and to what extent those projects are open projects. That is, do they foreclose a participation by others not named, or indeed rendered other, within the terms of the project, or are they visionary enough to remain open to future interventions that perhaps could not have been anticipated in the times of their production? And I actually said this to my graduate student class yesterday, and I think one of the reasons that's on my mind, and that it was appropriate to say to my seminar yesterday, has to do with the fact that we are witnessing a widespread renewal of interest in the moments that shaped these of Tania's books, and that these books in turn helped to shape. The interest is not only in academic feminism of the late 1970s and 1980s, but in second wave feminist formations more broadly. When such an interest is not motivated by nostalgia, it is responding to an impasse in our thinking about women and feminism and how to enable and inhabit a more just world. I understand Tania's work very much in that spirit. The two books that we are celebrating today seem to me to have been motivated by a frustration with certain impasses that are different from, but not unlike, our own. And happily, Tania still is an active participant in many of the scholarly projects feminist media studies continues to name today, and I, for one, am looking forward to being challenged and encouraged by her future work.
Well, I too would really like to thank everyone for the honor of being here, particularly Tania. It's a tremendous honor to be with you all. I also would like to note that I'd like to pick up, address a little bit Susan's point about classic and innovative, and Kara's point about subtle boldness. And although Lynn and I didn't speak at all about what we were talking about today, I think you'll find that there are a lot of shared interests. The mark of the mentor is strong in this one. Okay, so my contribution today is titled On the Urgency of Common Sense. And this title refers to the fact that Tania Modleski's writing, as Lynn mentioned, is so lucid, straightforward, and compelling as to always flatter the reader that she was thinking exactly these same brilliant observations. So in seeing them unfold on the page, the reader, line by line, reinforces her own common sense. Simultaneously, however, the deeply engaged political commitments of Modleski's work, its speaking to very real and ongoing problems in women's lives, underscores the urgency of Loving with a Vengeance, The Women Who Knew Too Much, and the collective works that followed. I'd like to address the urgency of common sense in particularly Loving with a Vengeance in three ways. First, by brief autobiographical thanks regarding the questions the work has encouraged me to keep central to my own scholarly endeavors, as Kara mentioned herself. Second, by pointing toward the ongoing and thoroughly contemporary ways that in both everyday media and increasingly, it appears, as Lynn mentioned, much television and media studies scholarship, criticism, to quote Modleski, finds it necessary to enhance the superiority of its objects, wherein the feminine text itself is often used as a standard by which other products are measured and found to be not wanting. That the surest way to damn a film, a television program, or even a situation in real life is to invoke an analogy to soap operas, unquote. Finally, I'd like to suggest some questions or sites that I find particularly important to think through these works going forward. So if you'll forgive me, a quick trip down memory lane. From 1986 to 1990, I was an undergraduate at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, where I was a double major in political science and cinema studies. My concentration in political science was in political theory, where I was introduced to thinkers such as Marx, Gramsci, Shulamith Firestone, Kate Millett, and others. In cinema studies, I gravitated to courses focused on questions of nation, ideology, and the politics of the popular. When not on campus, I was invariably asked by friends and their parents, with no small amount of chagrin, how on earth do those two majors go together? Though I understood what motivated such a question, how will you get a job? What kind of salary would a political theorist make? I never thought twice about the logic of my pairing. To me, these fields' theoretical and formal concerns, their political and cultural import, were the very stuff of common sense. But they were also invested with deep and compelling urgency. Why was the world around us envisioned in these ways? Who fundamentally was empowered to speak through these texts? How did class, geographic origin, race, and gender impact or determine the contours of cultural, social, and political power? Underscoring my belief that political theory and popular culture were crucially and necessarily interrelated was the fact that while writing a senior thesis in cinema studies, I discovered Tania Modleski's Loving with a Vengeance, her The Women Who Knew Too Much, and Mary Ann Doan's The Desire to Desire, the woman's film of the 1940s. Simultaneously, I saw Constance Penley's work on slash fiction and Star Trek presented at the now infamous Cultural Studies Conference, which took place on campus during my final year at Illinois. Each of these works and scholars contributed in no small part to my application to pursue a PhD at USC, if I don't, where, in the most fortuitous stroke of luck of probably my entire life, Lynn Spiegel arrived after my first year on campus. All this to say that, while throughout my studies I was aware of how truly threatening the progressive feminist ideas and ideals of Modleski's, Spiegel's, and their interlocutors' work was, my timing was exceptionally good mentoring fortunes also continued to affirm that these were fundamentally common sense ideas, brilliantly well written, and communicated in ways that spoke to the very real and urgent politics of everyday life. Flash forward. During the final season of HBO's series The Sopranos, Newsweek published a cover story intended to mount a defense regarding why TV is better than the movies. The feature article proposed that while historically television had witnessed periodic golden ages, contemporary TV was notable for the breadth and volume of series that now challenge cinema's presumptively higher cultural standing, both narratively and visually. States author Devin Gordon, and I quote, "The best shows tell their stories slowly, carefully, and with exquisite detail, putting viewers inside the experience of another person with unparalleled intimacy. This is the grand achievement of The Sopranos, and it's why the show's final season is a safe bet to be the cultural happening of the year," unquote. Last Sunday, a New York Times interview with actress Connie Britton noted that she worried of ABC TV's Nashville, in which she stars, that it, quote, might not rise above the level of a soap, unquote.
Nashville is great.
Connie Britton is. Though Britton herself is a self-proclaimed feminist, and much of the rest of the interview is focused on the actress's attempts to excise gendered cliches from the show's scripts with a weekly vigilance that in itself seems Emmy-worthy, it is clear from both Newsweek's redemption of quality TV as not TV and from the Times' recuperation of Nashville as not a soap opera that Loving with a Vengeance and The Women Who Knew Too Much are both thoroughly contemporary and remain critical to thinking through the politics of culture and capital as they are explicitly gendered in everyday life. While a close reading of the Newsweek passage describing The Sopranos would arguably just as easily describe Days of Our Lives, and in spite of Newsweek's proposal that the 2000s represent a completely new quality TV context, such claims for exceptions to TV as quality TV have been cyclically crucial to television historiography. In each instance, quality genres have suggested the promise of TV to be allied with official culture and the attendant educational, social, and economic capital characteristic of masculine ideals, high art, and enlightened intellectual pursuits against a feminized popular culture and its associated mass appeal and typical or further low capital. The standards of what constitutes quality in television have in this respect remained stable throughout broadcasting history, portrayed as not like the typical read feminized TV of its era, notable for its indebtedness to high cultural forms of expression such as literature, museum culture, and the legitimate stage, available for appreciation by an actively engaged, discriminating viewer, exemplifying truth value, literate dialogue, and depth of characterization, and privileging the socially conscious primetime text. In synchronicity with the concerns Tania poses in Loving, the late Ernest Pascucci has asked, what are we to make of so much theoretical work from the 1970s and 1980s that associated television with the death of public life while making no mention of contemporaneous civil rights, feminist, and gay rights movements, or of massive migration patterns of rural Southern blacks to northern and southwestern cities? Similarly, in the present moment, I would argue that we should look critically at revived or re-energized scholarly attention to the literary qualities of certain TV texts or the studio styles of cable outlets such as HBO, and relatively unifocal attention to quality TV over, for example, serious assessment of popular gratifications offered by mass appeal legacy network series like NCIS or Nashville. Clearly, one form of scholarship ratifies a particular kind of TV viewer and the scholar, her or himself. Digitalization privileges particular TV texts and audiences in ways that potentially skew scholarly analysis towards those who are already most cultivated and rewarded by industries and markets' attention. It is not coincidental that in the same moment that the mass audience has largely been broken into multiple narrow segments, television's critical reputation has changed for the better. There's a risk that in this moment and going forward, television studies might privilege industrial victors, might emphasize early adopter niche practices and demographics, and might focus on the kinds of texts that are best suited to multi-platform distribution and engagement across television, social network sites, and handheld media. As scholar Mary Desjardins has recently asked, what is media studies missing in not paying much attention to particular audiences and their preferred texts? Do we comply with media industries who also ignore these audiences? Why? In this context, I argue that feminist scholars should be concerned to ask where and how mass popular television continues to exist and thrive, and for whom. While the average number of television sets per household in the United States is at 2.5, only 56% of African Americans have broadband at home. Less than half of Latina Americans, low-income families, and rural Americans have adopted broadband. The United States is presently 15th in the world in terms of overall broadband penetration. Thus, the common sense urgency of Loving with a Vengeance in this moment. It is work that urges us to examine who is being actively excised from both the national policy conversations and from scholarly study and reward. But where does a broadly democratic television culture still exist as such? What are its pleasures and for whom? What represents a key televisual site of massive entertainment for countless numbers of women of varying ages, classes, and educational, as well as racial and geographic backgrounds, with narratives and iconography that speak to very real problems and tensions in women's lives? What is a popular cultural site that explicitly foregrounds issues and problems relevant to women in patriarchy and is characterized by a thoroughgoing ambivalence about femininity? I have argued that sport is the site where broadcast television not only still exists, it thrives. Sport generates the most mass and democratic and diverse audiences across the broadest broadcast, cable, and new mediascapes. Tania quotes Virginia Woolf on the masculine capital that accrues to sport, noting, quote, "Football and sport are important, the buying of clothes, the worship of fashion, trivial," unquote. I attempt to unpack the arguably increasing conflation of sport, consumption, fashion, and the troubling of gender identity and the resulting social and political ramifications of that. As a few scholars here today are also deeply invested in studying sport in these terms. Sport ostensibly reinforces the powerful social imaginary of civic masculine identity, and it's often dismissed as low, trivial ephemera. While there's a rich and crucially important body of work on the sociology of sport, sport has typically been left aside by television studies and media studies scholars within the humanities because, as Toby Miller argues, of misperceptions that it is not real politics or because it is occurring in a loved or hated sphere. Indeed, as television study within the academic humanities was founded in large part on the revaluing of culturally disdained genres and audiences, television sport appeared generally to be aligned with the most dominant cultural practices and to represent a site that was already perhaps overvalued in the culture at large. However, it's crucial to recognize a sea change in gender norms that is principally evident in sports media, largely due to sociocultural shifts following the passage of Title IX Education Act of 1972, and related to the recent development of a male beauty culture and in the marketing of the male body, all in a neoliberal context that has recast the concept of rights, commodity culture, and individual responsibility to encourage an explosion in female participation in sport and corporate media institutions' support for presumptively feminized sporting initiatives such as Race for the Cure, the NFL's Play 60 programs, and so forth. A feminist reading of the formal properties of the texts of sport brings us to Tania's proposal that contradiction is tremendously productive as an analytical problematic. To conclude by, I hope not offensively paraphrasing, on teaching Top Gun, meaning my appropriation being, okay. Quote, with respect to your sport media, we are involved in a contradiction. Even when we recognize it as retrograde, sport moves us, it works on us, it manipulates us, and we need to recognize how this happens. It is hard for us to disconnect ourselves from the apparatus once we are caught up in it, but analysis makes total innocence and dupery impossible. Interpretation is almost always more than interpolation. This may be common sense, but it is uncommonly urgent work.
I hardly know what to say. I'm so very moved and touched, and you know, I'm proud of these books, but I mean, come on, you know, whoa, like air. All I can say is thank you so very, very, very much for, you know, the most wonderful tribute that I could imagine. And I think anything I say now is going to be very disjointed, so I hope you don't mind. And I also would be really happy for people to jump in and start discussing some of the ideas that have been put forward. You know, this stuff about sport I hadn't thought of it at all, and it's like so rich and interesting to me. But what I especially want to thank you for is crediting me with common sense, because all my life, my father said, you have no common sense. You're smart, but you have no common sense. And it's like, so there, Dad. A little vengeance, you know. Got him back after all these years. And it's on tape, too, right?
Yes.
He's not alive, but anyway, I can at least listen to it and appreciate it deeply. So, you know, thank you for that. Lynn raised some, first of all, thank you for giving me an idea for the chapter of my book. I've been sort of floundering around, like, you know, I'm writing on male weepies now, and I kind of am doing comedy. Well, I know it's counterintuitive, but you know, comedy and Clint Eastwood, and working a little bit on Paul Thomas Anderson on how that's going to work out. Boogie Nights is, you know, I'm talking about melodrama. Oh yeah, I've had to have my say.
Because you actually wrote a little article for the LA Times, didn't you?
Yeah, but nobody would publish it.
Is that true?
Nobody would touch it with a 10-foot pole. So now I'm gonna like do a little self-publishing, I guess, because I'm gonna get it out. But this idea of TV. You know, I mean, I was just thinking, well, it's got to be movies. So I'm thinking, you know, do I want to do genre? Do I want to do another auteur? What about Quentin Tarantino and the nostalgia business? You know, back to Frederick Jameson again, and postmodern nostalgia, and that just seems so tired. But this whole question of the validation of quality TV that you both raise, and how melodramatic it is. And you know, I've been guilty. I mean, I've been watching these movies and thinking, boy, these are a lot better than, you know, films, and a lot better TV shows much more quality in them than, say, Dr. Kildare, which none of you will remember. But you got to admit, there's something to that. Although Grey's Anatomy. So yeah, some were obviously soap operas and others, but I thought the Breaking Bad example, and were you thinking of Homeland when you said about
definitely.
shooting your buddy
And
and
it's
throwing
more,
him in
I
a
mean,
ditch?
it just goes so along with what you were saying, that in order to validate, as Vicki was pointing out too, you have to use the negative example of what appealed to women in the past. You know, so it does seem like a perfect.
It's perfect. Cancer. I mean, how many terms of endearment, Steel Magnolia, how many, chick flicks have been, around dying women, dying whatever. But then when you have a man with cancer, it's like, it's just elevated. That's all. It's elevated in a way that all the reviewers can come in and get behind. And what I noticed when I was writing about Clint Eastwood is how many people couldn't kind of deny that there was like a little bit of sentimental, stuff going on in like $1 Million Baby and stuff, but they would say that it has, I wish I could remember the exact phrase, the melancholy of a great jazz piece or something like that. It was like this, so they would use terms like melancholy. They would even say sentimental. Sentimentalism is different, Kenneth Turan said, when it's in the hands of a Clint Eastwood. Show me the difference. Just like show me the difference. Seems like the same thing to me. So this business of doing quality television as melodrama really, really deeply appeals to me, and my own feelings about it. You watch it with the same kind of intensity, and you watch it on Netflix, and it's like 4 a.m, and you've just watched 6 episodes, and you can't still you can't stop. And it's a lot of it has to do with melodrama. I want to point out that one of my past students, John Knuckles, who's associated with the LA Opera now, did his dissertation on melodrama, and the connection between melodrama and opera is something that he continually celebrates, because opera seems to yes, it's melodramatic, but it raises it right to this other whole level. Well, I think John would have none of that if I'm not putting words into your mouth, but it's the melodrama is at the heart of it is something that you celebrate.
You just said this thing about binging on, Breaking Bad or whatever, and it's interesting because when you talked about women's soaps, it was always about interruption and the finding the moment to see it, and now it's about duration, just sheer marathon viewing. I wonder if you could make something of that. Maybe not at the moment.
Not at the moment. Thank you for getting that out. No, but also, soap operas did still keep you attached, right? Stay tuned tomorrow.
But it's different. Reception conditions.
But the reception conditions are very different, and they're watched, yes, in a very different context. But, soap operas, I talked about them in terms of women's, the housewife, but after I gave the paper on soap operas initially at a conference, a couple of men came up to me and said, I'm ashamed to admit it, but I watch soap operas, and students watch soap operas, and so I was really honed in on one reception context, but in fact neglected the possibilities of
I think when you were writing it, it was true that the major audience was women at home, and that's who the programmers and sponsors imagined. It wasn't until afterward, the later 80s and 90s, that they started seeing there was a huge college crowd, and and so I mean, you were when you were writing it.
When I was writing it,
that was the target.
Yeah, and how could I know there were so many closet men, male soap opera fans? I mean, right? I'm not I don't have a crystal ball, so I couldn't tell that. But I mean, that was really interesting to me then, because it was and of course, everything can be taken as proof of how right you are. And so it was like, far from contradicting what I had to say, it just went to show that this desire for kind of community that I said soap opera provided the isolated housewife was something that it could offer the male viewer as well, whose life was atomized in different ways, but still, not like an organic, meaningful whole, unlike women's lives too. So, so there's that. You talked also about something I wanted to talk about because a couple of you mentioned it. I've gone back to my notes on I Love You, Man. Too far back. That you said that that I tried at least to do this kind of juggling act of talking about pleasure versus containment. That women got pleasure, and that's something that we can affirm, but at the same time, it kept women in their place. So I think, and after some conference paper I gave, somebody came up to me and said, "Oh, thank you for writing that book. You made it possible for us to love soap operas." I was like, well, that's like one half of it maybe, but there's the other half. And throughout, like most of the reviews I ever got were like, she's too positive on the one hand, or she's too negative on the other hand. And lots of times I think people didn't at least see that I was trying to not be both. That sounds like anodyne, but trying to look at it as a complex phenomenon. So I think that's been something that's been a source of some frustration to me. The idea of working with contradiction, but I think that's central to working with popular culture, remains central, and not just popular culture, but too often we can just celebrate high culture as something that we just affirm, instead of looking at the ideological components of it and the way it works to contain as well. So there's that. You mentioned fan studies. When I used
I was scared to mention them.
Oh yeah, well, rightly so. Because it sort of sometimes makes my blood boil, but that's. I've gotten a lot of times when I've given. It happened to me like in Denmark and Norway for some reason a lot, where people would say, what about fan studies? What about ethnographic studies? And people wouldn't, which is fine to ask that as a question, but it seemed like that was always the question that, was posed to me. And I have problems with it. I do think that there's a place for it, and more I'm attracted to the kinds of sophisticated reception studies that people are doing today. But I think sometimes some of it tends to be quite naive. And one thing that kind of didn't get too emphasized in the panel is my sort of emphasis in all my work on psychoanalysis and on the unconscious, as a space as a place of repression of things that you can't admit. So if you go around and do ethnographic studies, and you're asking people what's your pleasure, how does such and such a text provide pleasure for you? They'll give you their understanding. And I remember a line from Janice Bradway saying, "I have never contradicted the women's understanding of their own pleasures." Well, first of all, I think she does go on to do that in the second part of her book, because I'm sure they didn't like some of the things that she said they were getting out of it. What was the second thing I was going to do? I'm so discombobulated. I'm going to say, the understanding, you know, and I wish I had put it this way in some articles that I wrote sort of responding. You know, the Marxist line, I think the point is not to understand the world, the point is to transform it. And so you know, in trying to answer it, you know, I try to talk about the feminist critic as somebody who kind of weighs in performatively and in bringing out some aspects of the text that maybe you don't want to kind of admit, like right off the bat. It's maybe a little bit hard for you to sort of say, well, yeah, I really, you know, my husband's a jerk sometimes, and I, you know, and I read these because it provides me with some other way of thinking about love than what I get from him. So, I mean, that's just a silly example, but it's, I think you take my point, that they're not going to say certain things, and you are going to say certain things, and then you're going to look like an elitist feminist, academic, ivory tower person coming in and telling them what it is they're getting out of it, when if you just go and ask them, they're getting no such thing. I think psychoanalysis is really crucial, and I know in film studies today I'll hear a lot of people say, oh, that old methodology, that it's been surpassed now, and we're moving on to different kinds of historical analyses and social all kinds of analyses which are important, but I don't see why we can't throw in psychoanalysis into the mix, and in fact I think it's absolutely crucial. So these are just a few of the thoughts that I have kind of rattling around in my head from some of the questions that have arisen, but I would love to hear from any of you in response to what's been said.
Yeah, let's just open it up.
Jill.
Let's see. I wanted. First of all, I just wanted to mention. Doesn't House watch soap operas?
Yeah, he does.
Good example of them on the outlet. But
I have to make a note of that.
Yeah.
you know, this opposition between the ethnographic and the psychoanalytic, it doesn't take into account the way you advocate for the female viewer in your work, I think, because, I mean, you are doing both. I mean, it's an appreciation of why women are fans of these, of the romances and the soap opera, but as you just, you know, were describing, you don't just stop with that. You're going to also draw on the theoretical and the psychoanalytic categories to delve further into it and to try to understand more about it, which is so useful. And because I think in some ways too, the ethnographic can seem more like, oh, that's the practical application, but and the theoretical is you know, elitist or not useful. And I just want to say, as someone who teaches at Fresno State and teaching you know, first generation college students, that whenever I talk about and try to explain or succeed in explaining, I should say, certain concepts in cultural studies and in film criticism, especially the concept of the utopian promise of mass culture. I use your example, and I do cite you, of the soap operas as a world where, and I usually give an example like a world where there's always time for dealing with emotions and talking about emotions. And my students, both male and female, will laugh when they hear that example, but I know it is a laugh of recognition, and because they understand the concept instantly by, you know, benefiting from your work. So I wanted to express that appreciation to you for that.
Thank you. I was thinking about The Bachelor, which is, you know, one of my guilty pleasures. You watch it? Oh, yeah. Yeah, okay.
I haven't seen this season.
And I what was I thinking? Oh, that you were talking about soap operas as camp or kitsch, and so much of I think of TV viewing is campy and kitschy,
Yeah.
not just among
Intentionally,
academics,
yeah.
but intentionally so. And yet there's another level at which it's not that at all. And I remember teaching a few years ago a course in women in popular culture, which met on Tuesday mornings, and it just so happens that The Bachelor was starting at the same time on Monday nights. So we started watching that season of The Bachelor, and it was really hard for me not to go in and say, you know, can you believe that Vienna? You know, this is so awful. And really hard to, like, move beyond like that. And that was like a lesson to me, you know, I think, because I like to think I can always come in and do the analysis. But, and you know, as I watch it, I feel like I'm watching it in a very campy kind of way. And, but it's getting it to me at some other level as well. And it's like, who's he going to pick? And, what? He's going to pick her? You know? And also talk about the misogyny. You know, it's like, man, she's just like so unappealing. Yeah, so just the guilty pleasure.
You just get into the trap of what they're trying. Right?
Anyway, other. Judith.
Hey, Tanya. Congratulations. Obviously, this is such a lovely event.
Thank you.
You know, I read your work as a grad student, and it really sent me off in all kinds of different directions. I read your piece, I remember it very clearly, in Studies in Entertainment, which was such a brilliant anthology. And it gave me a different way of thinking about gendering discourses, and so on. And I've always used your work in a very queer context, in queer studies context, even though that's not exactly how you pitch your work. But I think in your work we find a sort of a very thorough ongoing critique of the narrativization of heterosexuality. And I wonder if there's a way for you to just kind of situate that as a queer studies project, which I think it is. And maybe speak a little bit about your relationship to queer studies.
Well, I do find myself being influenced by you a lot, and I hope if you've been influenced by me, I can take a little bit of credit for your reading of Dude, Where's My Car? Which, if you have not read it, it's like, talk about a classic. It is truly, truly, truly classic. So that sort of things. I've been thinking a lot about the queer potential of romances, and of course, you got there first. I've not seen Ted yet, but obviously will see Ted. Sometimes it's kicking and screaming that I go to these movies, but it's Mark Wahlberg, and if I can get him again,
But you
I'd be
remember,
happy
Tanya,
to.
that terrible movie I took you to years ago?
Which one?
Well, there was one really, really awful movie, and I thought it was going to end our friendship. And I think it was animated, and there may have been, it may have been an animal. It wasn't Babe. It was a terrible movie, and I remember after it ended, it was just, you were withering. And I thought, oh,
Bride of Chucky?
Bride of Chucky?
No, it wasn't. No. Because that,
like Bride of Chucky, right?
it will come to us eventually.
I don't. Are you sure it was animated? I've seen so few animated pictures in my life.
Maybe just felt animated.
Yeah.
No.
Well, think about it. I'd be interested
But it was a bad
in
experience.
arguing
And
about it
it's
again.
true, we have seen a lot of bad movies.
Yeah. But good bad movies, like Dude, Where's My Car?
Yeah.
It's like
Different category.
when I saw that, I was like, boy, there's nothing to be said about this movie. And then I read your analysis, and it was like, whoa. So, what am I going to say? So thinking about the bromances and taking into account the misogyny, taking into account the homophobia, and at the same time, seeing something going on that is like, that you could say is, the emergence of some sort of queerness. I don't want to say queer sensibility, but some sort of queerness. And I've just been trying to write about film I just mentioned, I Love You Man, where he tries to find a male friend, and the sort of trying to position himself between heterosexuality and outright homosexuality, but the kind of questioning that's going on of, you know, what it means to be a man, what it means to have a relationship with another man, how you can have one, what the language is for it, because the whole one of the funny jokes about I Love You Man is that he keeps saying, you know, he keeps trying to like speak in bro language, but he does it so badly. So he's called by, Jason Segel calls him Pistol Pete, and he says, thanks a lot, Jobin. And then they go, Jobin? You know, I just called you Jobin. And continually he's using words to try to speak like a man, but he doesn't know what that is. Right. There's also a character who's sort of marked as heterosexual, but he has this voice that keeps kind of being like squeaky and then low and squeaky and then low. It's done in this brilliant way. So that, you know, the kind of queer stuff that's emerging from these male weepy / bromance comedies is something that I've just begun to think about, and a lot of that is thanks to the work that you're doing and a couple of other people are doing.
Your earlier work has this anatomization of heterosexuality, structures that get taken for granted that you actually unpack. You know, even as when you were talking about, you know, the things that women can't say about their investment in the soap opera or in the romance, that it might be about a lack in the texture of heterosexuality, but that can't be spoken, and therefore narrative fills in the gap. And so I feel you don't have to go to a homoerotic relationship, because it's, for me, there's a
I see what you're saying.
There's a
Interesting.
theorization of heterosexuality in your work that very few other people have done, I would say, in that detail.
Oh my, so glad to hear that. You know, I was queer before it became, you know, before it became queer. No, but I was doing a Skype thing on yesterday with somebody's class, and they had assigned Feminism Without Women, and the first chapter, and I was talking about how everybody goes around saying, you know, white privilege, which, yes, is something that white feminists need to interrogate, but also talking about heterosexual privilege. And I said, you know, feminism has done a lot to talk about how it may be no great privilege to be a wife in patriarchy, you know, and these things sometimes get, you know, just get lost, and just heterosexual privilege that's something that we can just take as a pure good for women. So is that the sort of thing you were talking about?
I mean, there's so much to say.
Yeah. Thank you.
Well, you know, many of us who have written books have had the experience of finding exactly what you've described, which is that people will pick up on part of the analysis and seemingly ignore the other part of the argument, and so this is a familiar sort of phenomenon, and it will happen to those of you who will publish books. You know, it's like, what book was this person reading? But the question,
and what is an author? You really feel that when you read reviews, your work. Yeah.
But I wanted to ask you a somewhat, you know, I'm curious about whether or not there's any piece of your work that, when you now think about it, but in particular these two books, any piece of the arguments that you put forward in these texts that you would now write differently or think about differently?
Do I stand by everything I ever said in my life? Yes.
Well, you can.
Well, there are. I mean, I read things sometimes that I haven't, you know, I wrote them 20 years ago, like the thing I was doing just yesterday, and I was reading it again, and it's weird. It's like somebody else wrote them after a while, and you're like saying, I wonder what I meant by that. You know, the little question mark in the margin, or, you know, very rarely, good point.
Yes, Velma got up on the desk and might have
Yeah,
composed
right.
a few lines.
She composed a few lines. So, yeah, as I'm reading, there are a lot of things that I just, that I kind of blush at
Yeah, yeah.
or, think, wouldn't say that anymore. Especially the second chapter. To go back to the question of sexuality, in the second chapter I talk about the way mass culture is feminized, and I use Mama Puig's Kiss of the Spider Woman, and there I don't really, I think, do justice to the fact that we're dealing here with a transvestite. I just see him as the feminine voice, and mass culture as the feminine. So yeah, all the time I come across things where I just think, God, it's horrible to be published because like you can't take it back.
No,
I mean, you
no.
can, but not really. You can, you can issue retractions
Well,
all
Freud
over the
did.
place.
Freud constantly took everything back, like his footnotes, right?
Who?
Freud.
Freud,
Oh,
yeah,
oh.
yeah.
Maybe that's why you like him.
Maybe that's why I like something else. Yeah, well, yeah. But, and
Okay.
I am no Freud.
Questions? Observations? Karen, yeah.
I was just going to ask a really frothy question that was not, it was a sort of a frothy question about whether or not you watch Scandal and Revenge.
I'm ready to watch
Thinking
Scandal.
Vengeance,
Yeah.
Living with a Vengeance. Thinking about the ways in which kind of vengeance gets characterized
Yeah.
in the contemporary television
Yeah.
landscape with these certain kind of strong and ostensibly feminist.
Yeah, Revenge is on my list. Devin got me onto that a long time ago, but I haven't watched it. I will have to say that I was sort of creepily attracted to a couple of movies. I can't remember the name of it. It wasn't around very long, but it was about a guy who. Those movies where you have to act outside the law to get revenge against people. Vigilante. But it was always like about guys, kind of coming along and taking revenge on behalf of people who can't get any vengeance from the law, so they go outside of it. So I had to question, like what my investment was of having some guy come along and solve it. So so this new thing which is really not so new, the vengeance thing, because Carol Clover, of course, a long time ago wrote about like the rape revenge films. So there is a kind of history in popular culture of women getting revenge, and of course she was interested in the fact that these were marketed to a young male audience. Why did they like to see men being castrated after raping women? Because they're masochistic. That was her answer. But it's complicated.
Michelle, did you have a question? I saw a hand.
It was not my hand.
You had a question.
I just wanted to express also my gratitude with your scholarship, but one thing that hasn't been mentioned is that it's had a profound impact on cultural producers because it's been out now since the 80s and 90s. These are texts that we've been using in teaching, and so we've produced maybe even 2 generations of people working in television and in film. And one thing that I found really interesting was your comment about The Bachelor and all of these ironic TV shows and films. You mentioned Tarantino that wink at us and already have this sort of understanding of the ambivalence in popular culture.
Right.
And so I wanted to ask you to comment on that irony now, because the text that you were dealing with in terms of the soap opera of the 80s, that was direct communication. That wasn't this sort of ironic hipster communication that's always at a meta level. So what do you make of current television now that's in a sense using your eye, or the eye of film and television scholars, to possibly be apologizing excuse continued sexism.
Oh, so like Quentin Tarantino.
Oh, he's a very good example. Tarantino, but even sort of texts that basically say, we know that we're being ironic, that we're, that it's a debased popular cultural form, but we are already basically excusing ourselves from it because we're already in the know, wink, wink. You know what I mean? How I find that a lot of talks use this term scare quotes all the time. Like everything is indirect with communication. Do you know what I'm saying?
Yeah, I think so. I'm not sure what they're doing is what I was doing, but I mean, I do think somebody like Tarantino is, obviously has been exposed to some of this stuff and is incorporating it. But
And they've become cultural producers. They're the ones who are working in advertisement and television. They're thinking about your work, and then so the question is how to get out of that box. If they've already got the critical apparatus, do you know what I'm saying?
Yeah, and I think
I don't really have an answer for it.
no, I don't think I quite do either. But I think bromances might be a good example of that sort of winking about its own homophobia, winking about its misogyny. So I do think that you're right. I do think that a lot of people, it's not me, but it's a whole generation of people who have started talking about popular culture, and these are people who attend college and good schools and read the stuff and incorporate it into what they're doing, and it does make it kind of harder to find some kind of critical stance with respect to it. I mean, I am struggling with that, especially around Paul Thomas Anderson's later work. Yeah. And Django Unchained, I can be as racist as I want because I'm not racist kind of thing is very common, I think, in popular culture today. Everybody knows I'm not.
I can't believe that in this room there is not somebody who has a question. Yes.
Is this the Twilight question?
We actually have lots of questions about the closer, about the end of the closer, as series and the politics of that, and some politics of apology at the end of the show, and about the racial politics and class politics of that show. But I want to kind of, maybe that speaks to the question that we wanted to ask. So on the one hand, I think your work kind of is really interested in looking at feminist media, right, and sort of and claiming, soap opera as a sort of part of that in a way, but also deconstructing the kind of masculinist notion of art, of good art, high art, or whatever. But I also feel that there's a kind of sometimes there's a difference, like part of the valuation of, say, Clint Eastwood's repeats is because they engage in a more direct conversation about, say, race or war or nation or whatever, and there's a way in which feminine genres tend not to indulge in an equally open conversation on that. So I'm wondering if you see any difference in the contours of those today. And I don't mean this as a kind of justification of the devaluation of feminine genres at all, or what's coded as feminine genres, right? But I'm thinking if there's a way in which you think maybe shows like Revenge or Scandal, which sort of have a certain, seem to engage with politics of race in a more overt way. Is there a kind of shift happening then? Is it a desirable one, or where is it going? I don't know if it's your question.
Well, certainly something like Homeland is engaged with the questions that you're talking about, and it has, at its center of a heroine, psychotic though she be. So I think there's more of that, but I think it's still the kind of Jane Austen writes on a small little square of ivory, and men are like invoking things like nation and stuff like that, and that's true even today of popular culture itself. I think that's just the general way, I would answer that without having too many specifics. But I've been really interested in Homeland because it does address those however you want to say it addresses it. It does invoke the larger questions of terrorism and nation and
even to close it, I was thinking of that as another genre which sort of set itself up to kind of, its location in LA was very self-conscious because of, its racial segregation, class segregation.
yeah.
And it was, again, a very sort of, feminist show in some ways.
And feminine in others, especially with the ending. I think so. And there was a kind of corruption that she embodied, and it became more and more pronounced as the show went on. And at least part of me wants to celebrate that we can have corrupt heroines.
Right.
I mean, I don't, trying to like positive role models. Let's have some corruption.
Well, doesn't it go back to the women we love to hate too idea in a sense? I mean, I don't know. Do you know the series Hit and Miss?
No.
Yeah, it's a very peculiar show. Does anyone know this? Hit and Miss. It's a transsexual who wants to get reunited with her family and is a hit woman at the same time to make a living.
Oh, I heard about that.
Why do we not know about this?
And this is like a fantastic, she's having a sex change. She starts off as male, she's going to female, and you see full body shots in the shower, and and
channel is that on?
it was like was it canceled? It was DirecTV. No, it finished. It was a series, and it finished the first segment of it.
So maybe Netflix will have it
it
for a while.
really had this sort of complexity and ambivalence. I think that, I don't want to be too teleological about this, but in a sense, seeing your work as sort of setting the stage for all these different directions of ambivalence that have emerged, and the series Damages too, for instance, where
Another
both,
great anti-heroine.
Exactly,
yeah.
but you both love her, and then the mother-daughter with, so in that sequence, but Hit and Miss I would recommend, because it really, it's very difficult, to watch her, split, put on the hood, go out and, and follow a hit for the money to take care of the family, so it's a
Does anyone know
union.
this?
I read about it. It did get some publicity.
So it wasn't just Susan who watched it.
Narrowcast. Nielsen polls one viewer. The Susan Network. Yeah. Yeah, I think what you said about also the way in which all of these various shows now are carving out smaller and smaller niches is something that is really crucial to address. And I think you do, that's where reception studies, that's where reception studies is could be, I think, very useful. But I was thinking of a funny Jon Stewart thing about how, what do you mean the war against Christmas? And he gives all the examples of how you can't escape Christmas. And he says there's even an entire network devoted to a Yule log, which is true, and we actually used it at a party once, and people thought it was very effective. I guess it was a little camp, a little kitsch there, but still it worked. It was the same kind of ambivalence that you get in any program. But yeah, so that's like the reductio ad absurdum of the sort of narrowing down of subject matter and of occasion and so on to appeal to a very specific audience at a very specific time for a very specific reason. And there's so much of that now. And so I don't know, I would like to hear from, maybe Vicki talk a little bit more about that phenomenon of the narrower audiences and subject matters.
That's, I guess, what I was I've been fascinated by is the ways in which just a lot of TV studies scholars seem to be focusing on the narrower and narrower, and I guess in my curmudgeonly way, I'm really interested in where the kind of mass text still actually exists.
Mm-hmm.
And
Hence sports.
right,
Yeah.
but I think too, I mean, the industry refers now to like ABC, NBC, and CBS as legacy networks,
Yeah.
right?
Wow.
Like this, like old traditional, but it's still capturing the most eyeballs and the most diverse, right, audiences. So, in terms of your critiques of fan studies and approaches to fan studies, my how to say it, my criticism of that work has always been along those lines, which is the objects that fan studies scholars tend to focus on are either or tend to be subcultural or perceived as alternative, as you point out in your work, perceived to be already alternative. And yet there are actually thriving fan cultures of what one might call mainstream popular texts, right? And I raised this question once at a conference, and people, I said, well, what about like fans of JAG or NCIS, who have also a thriving online fan culture, which is very interesting. It's has more similarities to rock and roll fandom because it's a lot about cataloging, like medals and things like that. But because the object itself was unappealing to those scholars, or they indeed perceived it to be low and unworthy of their attention, it didn't get talked about. So that's, and both in terms of masculinized objects like an NCIS or something, and other kinds of feminine texts, which weren't perceived to be cultish or fascinating by the scholar, and therefore neglected as an object. But I wrote about Lawrence books.
So it's kind of like a new double standard where, like, the more sort of despised a show might be, the more a scholar is interested in it. And something like NCIS, which everybody loves, nobody wants to study.
Well, and I was at a conference recently where people were joking about, very negatively about a program like According to Jim, right? Which, the joke, well, nobody ever saw it, but of course people saw it because it was rated really well, right? And maybe it didn't die because it was just too neutral a text to die or whatever. It was scheduled very well. But why questions aren't asked about the popularity of a mainstream text. And of course there are obvious reasons for that in terms of what might allow you to earn tenure or what might allow you to be published in certain venues. But I do think that to be a scholar of the popular means to look at popular text.
But it's interesting because I would argue, I wouldn't say the exact opposite has happened, but when you look at popular music studies, that's an area in which there's been a much more aggressive shift towards the study of music that is popular, in fact, as opposed to sort of deeply fetishized, obscure indie music. And so it's interesting that these two areas of study seem to be sort of moving in different directions, at least at the moment.
Yeah, that is possible.
Because it is very different.
I guess Henry did the huge fan thing on Survivor, right? Henry Jenkins. So that's hugely popular. But I think you're right. People tend to pick things that, well, it's the other part of the piece that everyone's trying to find high art in television these days. And, that's kind of...
But there's a sense
and
of...
it's a different kind of narrative, right? Like Survivor has more in common as a kind of narrative object with the sort of science fiction texts and other types of texts.
Do you think it's sports also?
Well, that's what's, I think that one of the conundrums about sport is it's always contradictory in terms of, well, there's an outcome, right? Somebody wins or whatever. But also in terms of network practices, it's that which never ends. It's like a soap opera in that sense, too. And it's so proliferate. So to me, the kind of conundrum there has been that while sport is presumptively masculine in terms of appeals and all of those sort of cultural hierarchies, it also operates in ways culturally that have been historically feminized. So.
But I was asking about Survivor. Would you call that?
Oh, call it a sport?
Well, because people on it have to really bodybuild and I have a
Interesting,
colleague who's
yeah.
trying to get on it, and he gained like 100 pounds in like a year.
You have to lose so much.
He's doping,
Yeah.
you know. I mean, it's just, but it's like sports, you know, from that point of view.
Yeah, I mean, I've been thinking about that, but also shows like Wipeout and stuff like that. Like, where is the generic boundary? Of course, UFC.
Tanya, I wanted to ask.
Yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry.
No.
Because you're such a great teacher, so I wanted to ask you if you could talk a little bit about the role pedagogy plays in your work. Because I mean, I think you're really, somebody who's done all this kind of writing. But as long as I've known you, you've really cared about preparing your classes, And you can't say that about everybody. I mean, they really matter to you, and I think, like the people here are shaking their heads. They know that you really care about your classes. And, Tanya came to Northwestern a couple of times, and one time she just came to my dissertation writing class, and I couldn't really believe it. She read everybody's proposals before she came. That was amazing for somebody visiting and giving a talk, to actually sit down and read all my students' proposals, know them, talk to them about their work. So I just wanted to know what, you think about the kind of role pedagogy plays in feminist work. And
Well, I first decided I wanted to be a professor, not because I wanted to be in a profession or have a career. I thought it was an extension of my politics. I could just go and preach the word, to people and grade them, according to the correctness of their politics. That's how much I care. It was, it's still, all these years later, still surprises me to be in a profession and have a career, because that wasn't the idea. Okay, that was just supposed to be an aside, but now, what was I going to say? Oh, so, teaching Top Gun, I wrote about, did you mention that, or you mentioned it? I wrote about teaching Top Gun, and I teach it every year in my ARLT course. No matter what, I teach it, and then I will get an evaluation. It'll say, "What did you learn?" And it'll say, "Top Gun homosexual film." Just to talk about the homoeroticism of Top Gun, it's to blow their mind so much they don't hear anything else for the entire course. So, but I do keep on trying, and I will never stop as long as that film is seen by so many people still after all this time. So it's hard. I mean, when you are a psychoanalytic critic, it's just really hard to be teaching classes and trying to talk about what the appeal of popular culture might be. That's not immediately obvious to them, and I have found it to be a struggle. And I've just been so irritated over the years. We don't do this anymore, but I used to be like pushing TVs and video cassette recorders, around, and I would get into the elevator, and all these professors would say, "Oh, it must be so much fun to do what you do." And it's like, no, it's hard. You go into a Shakespeare class, and I actually visited somebody who was teaching Shakespeare, and what I couldn't get over was how much they were like preening themselves at being in a Shakespeare class. And, they were all invited to read passages, they were all like really into it, and it was like, they were all like, yes, we were Shakespeareans, and it was, I thought that looked kind of easy compared to teaching Top Gun. And so, but then I teach Jane Austen. I think, aha, so now I'm going to teach like high culture. No, it's like, I teach Northanger Abbey, start with Northanger Abbey, and it's like, Henry is no Mr. Darcy. So they're into the popular Jane, because there's a whole industry of Janeitism, and they're into the popular Jane Austen. So Shakespeare's still the way to go if you want to teach an easy course, in my opinion.
I did buy you a little present, and it's appropriate right now.
Jane Austen bandages with a free prize inside. 5 large assorted plasters. I'm sure you all want to know what the free prize is.
Yeah.
I'll open it up. Gosh, this is so exciting. Okay, this must be the prize.
A Jane Austen tattoo.
A tattoo!
Who
Who doesn't? I don't get it.
Oh, it's a joystick.
A joystick.
Joystick.
Yeah.
For the Jane
That's
Austen
a Jane Austen tattoo.
Joystick.
Huh. Of course.
Okay. Well,
Sorry.
thank you very much.
Well, does anyone have any more presents?
Thank you. I love having
I could close this out with presents.
I'll take my gifts now, and oh, thank you. That's really.
No, seriously, are there any more questions? Do you all want to ask each other any more questions or make any more observations? Yes, Jill.
Well, I was just thinking in terms of the sports topic about the halftime shows.
Oh, yeah.
Especially, obviously, Super Bowl is the biggest of all, but the cheerleaders have been there for a number of decades now. But in terms of the position of the female body within sports, and it seems that the halftime shows at Super Bowl have really worked around it, the female performer and female body. I just was curious if you had any thoughts about that.
Not specifically yet, but indeed, some of my questions about the NFL's history with television began by thinking about the halftime show at the Super Bowl and how my earliest memories of that were of Up With People performing.
Yeah, Up With People.
And it's morphed into Beyonce performing. So I was very interested with the kind of sort of cultural branding of the league in terms of gendered bodies and performance during the Super Bowl. So yeah, I'm very interested in those questions, but I don't know where they're going yet.
You'd have to add Springsteen and Jagger too, really, because the male body is.
But also there's another element to that, and that is that they usually have a woman as a reporter on the actual
field,
sidelines.
Right.
And then all the real male experts are up in a booth. And so therefore they go to her for the human soft stories, right?
How did it feel to win such a trophy?
What are you going to do next, Coach? Well, we're just going to push it, That's what they're going to do.
Yeah.
So it's all now part of the spectacle.
I guess I have one last question. Kara mentioned in relationship to your work, Tanya, that it was great to create these sort of genealogies, to think about how some work influences others, and it was really great for me to think about Kara's work in relationship to yours. Not in terms of common sense so much as in terms of uncovering certain structures that are there but are so buried deep into the mechanics of a piece that you actually can't find them. And then when someone reveals them, which is true in both Kara's work and your work, you kind of don't know how you couldn't have seen that before.
Yeah.
And I guess I wonder, I'd love to hear, people talk about genealogies a little bit, and who was the person who really influenced you, Tanya? And then what kind of legacy do you think that you've created? I mean, I think Kara gave a really nice appraisal of that.
I think I will answer. I did want to say that, like, your reading Leaves by You, was like, oh my God, I've done all the things that she criticizes all the liberal critics are talking about. That's the way I've been teaching it, but no more. So again, it's nice to know that in fact, I helped you produce something that made me see something I was not seeing at all. Well, back in the day, there were people who were writing about the utopian dimensions of popular culture, and Hans Magnus Enzensberger probably influenced me.
That's who came to mind.
He's so widely read these days. I know. But that essay was really important to us. And Walter Benjamin's The Work of Art in the Age of Mechanical Reproduction. Certain aspects of his work. Other aspects, not so much, but his, that attempt to sort of see what cinema brings, that's really new, and also how it relates. One of my articles that was then becomes part of the book was called "The Rhythms of Reception in Daytime Television," and the rhythms of reception was a phrase from Benjamin talking about the rhythm of reception of like montage and things like that, and how it tied in with factory work and things like that. So I would say those were a couple of the critics that made me start thinking about. But then, of course, there were all the feminists who were, blonde. They weren't. The first thing feminists did, and I would have done too, was to make fun of like Harlequin romances and soap operas. Because there's a lot to criticize, and that was part of I think a necessary consciousness raising that went on. And so my wanting to affirm sort of women's pleasure came out of the sisterhood is powerful kind of moment, but it was also going against the sisterhood in its kind of overall dismissal of the kinds of things that were just women cherishing the chains of their bondage. That's what Germaine Greer said of Harlequin romance readers. And I was like, no, they're not just. No. It's not that simple. It's not just that they're imbibing patriarchal ideology. So, I was very much of my time and contesting it, but at the same time gaining lots of support and sustenance from it, and I miss it. Can I tell you again how very, very much this has meant to me? This has been like pretty much the high point of my career, and your response is just so lovely, and I never expected it. I want to thank you all. I'm sure I didn't deserve all of what you said, but I will take it and cherish it. And Alice, thank you so very much for doing this. And not waiting until my memorial service.